Chapter 10. A perfect visit ends in disaster. A few days later, the General announced that he had to go to London on business for a week. As he was leaving, he said, "Miss Morland, more than anything, I regret that I will be robbed of your charming company for a whole week. I have instructed Eleanor and Henry to look after you, and I hope you will tell them if there is anything they can do to make your stay more amusing or more comfortable." The General's departure gave Catherine her first understanding of the principle that a loss may sometimes be a gain. The three young people had much more fun without General Tilney in control of their lives. Every meal was a scene of enjoyment and ease, and every day was spent as the three wished. These delightful days made our heroine love the place and the people more and more. Catherine was now in the 4th week of her visit and had never been happier. But the fact that she had been there for almost a month made her wonder whether it was polite to stay any longer, or whether she should suggest choosing a date for her return to Fullerton. Although it was an unpleasant subject, Catherine took the first opportunity to speak to Eleanor about it. "Dear Eleanor, I think I must return home soon." "Oh, Catherine," Eleanor began with feeling. "I had hoped for the pleasure of your company for a much longer time. If your parents knew how much we enjoyed having you here, do you think they might allow you to stay a bit longer?" "Oh, my parents are in no hurry to have me at home. They are always satisfied if I am happy." "Then why are you in such a hurry to leave us?" asked Eleanor, with a worried look on her face. "But I have been here so long," Catherine cried. "If you have grown tired of being here, I cannot urge you to stay," Eleanor said sadly. "Oh, no, you misunderstand me. For my own pleasure, I would be very happy to stay another 4 weeks, but I do not wish to become a nuisance." "Catherine, it is settled then. You must not think of leaving us. Henry and I will be very sad to lose you, so you must stay as long as possible." Eleanor's desire for her to stay longer at Northanger Abbey was so sincere that it confirmed Catherine's secret belief that the Tilneys hoped she would belong to their family one day. Henry's obligations at Woodston took him away during his father's absence, but Catherine continued to be happy because it gave her time to get to know Eleanor better and to enjoy her company. On the evening of Henry's departure, the young ladies were still sitting and chatting at the dinner table at 11 o'clock, a rather late hour at the Abbey. Then, as they walked to their bedrooms, they heard a carriage arrive outside, and in the next moment they heard the loud noise of the doorbell. "Who could that be at this late hour?" wondered Eleanor. "It must be Frederick. I will say good night, dear Catherine, and go downstairs to welcome him." Catherine went into her room, thinking about meeting Captain Tilney the next morning at breakfast. She hoped that he would not mention Isabella's name or the part he had played in her brother's unhappiness. She thought she could be polite to him, as long as no one talked about Bath. Half an hour later, Catherine heard someone come up the stairs, and then her door opened very gently. Eleanor came into her room, looking pale and quite nervous. Catherine worried that Captain Tilney was in some kind of trouble and made Eleanor sit down. After a minute or two of silence, Miss Tilney said, "My dear Catherine, I have come to you with bad news, and I do not know how to tell you about it. Oh, how shall I tell you? Has something happened to Henry? Is there a messenger from Woodston downstairs? No, it is not anyone from Woodston. My father himself has arrived. Eleanor's voice shook, and she looked at the carpet when she said, "My father." Catherine was disappointed to know that General Tilney had returned early, but she waited for Eleanor to explain more. "You are so good and kind. A friend who will understand how difficult this is for me, especially after we had happily agreed that you would stay for another 4 weeks. I am an unwilling messenger who has to tell you that we must part. My father has remembered that we accepted an invitation to go to Lord Longton's house near Hereford for a fortnight. We leave on Monday. Explanation and apology are equally impossible. My heart is too heavy to attempt either." "My dear Eleanor, don't be distressed. I am very, very sorry that we must part so soon, but I am not offended. An earlier engagement must take priority, and I can finish my visit later, or you can come to me at Fullerton after Hereford." "It will not be in my power to do that," Eleanor said quietly. "Come to Fullerton when you can, then." Eleanor did not respond to this suggestion, and Catherine continued, "Monday's very soon. And are you all going?" "Don't worry, Eleanor. I can be ready to go on Monday morning. We can be together until it is time for you to depart. It will not bother my parents if I show up unannounced on Monday evening. The General will send a servant with me, I imagine, for half the trip, and then I will be at Salisbury and only 9 miles from home." "Catherine, I wish I could tell you that those were the arrangements, but what can I say? You must leave us tomorrow morning. The carriage has been ordered to be waiting for you at 7 o'clock. And no servant will accompany you." Catherine sank into a chair, unable to breathe or to speak. "Dear Catherine," Eleanor continued, "I could hardly believe my senses when I was told. No disappointment or anger on your part could be greater than my own. What will your father and mother say after we took you away from the Allans, your true friends, and brought you here so far from your home? And now you are cruelly driven out of the house without the smallest consideration for your comfort or safety. Dear, dear Catherine, I had to deliver the message, but you know that I have no real power in this house. I think you know who is responsible for this insult." "Have I offended the General?" Catherine asked weakly. "I can think of nothing that you have done to offend him, but I have never seen him so angry." Catherine struggled to speak for Eleanor's sake. "I am very sorry if I have upset him. It is the last thing I would do on purpose. But don't be unhappy, Eleanor. You must go to Hereford and keep your engagement. I am only sorry that the trip was not remembered sooner, so I could have written home, but it will not matter to my family. They will be happy to see me." "But you should not have to make the journey alone." "Oh, the journey is nothing. It is less than 70 miles. Don't think about that. I can be ready at 7. Please ask your servant to call me in time." After Eleanor left, Catherine burst into tears. She was being thrown out. With no reasonable explanation nor apology from General Tilney, she was being rudely sent home. She could not even say goodbye to Henry. And what about her hopes? Would she ever see him again? How could a man who had been so polite and kind to her, who had treated her fondly throughout her time at Northanger Abbey, now act so rudely towards her? She must have offended him in some way, and given him reasons for treating her so badly. 7 o'clock. He wanted her out of the house before he left his bedroom in the morning. Catherine spent another sleepless night at Northanger Abbey, but this time she was not frightened by imagined ghosts and mysterious chests and cupboards. This time her anxiety had a basis in fact, and neither the wind nor the darkness bothered her. Instead, she lay awake, wondering how things had gone so badly wrong. By the time Eleanor came to her room at 6 in the morning, Catherine had finished her packing and she was almost dressed and ready to depart. Both young women remained silent, neither knowing how to improve the situation. At the breakfast table, Catherine could not eat, but she thought about breakfast the day before. Happy, happy breakfast. Henry had been there, and the 3 of them had chatted, enjoying everything present and fearing nothing in the future except Henry's visit to Woodston for a few days. Henry had sat beside her and helped her to food, and so Catherine now lost herself in this memory. Then she heard the carriage arrive outside and remembered what was happening. Eleanor now felt the need to speak and hurried to say, "You must write to me, Catherine, as soon as possible. You must tell me you are safe at home and have found your family well. I will not expect more. Please send a letter to me at Lord Longton's, but address it to his daughter, my friend Alice." "No, Eleanor," Catherine answered quietly. "If you are not allowed to receive a letter from me, I think I had better not write. I will have no trouble getting home safely." "I am not surprised by your feelings, dear Catherine, and will not urge you to do something you are unhappy about," Eleanor answered sadly, with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Eleanor, I will write to you. Please don't worry." "Thank you, Catherine. And there is one more thing. You have been so long away from home that I wonder if you have any money left for the journey." Catherine quickly looked into her purse and said, "I had not thought about money, but you are right. I cannot pay for the journey to Fullerton." Eleanor gave Catherine money from her own purse. Soon the carriage was announced to be ready, and Catherine and Eleanor's silent, sad looks expressed more than any words could. They hurried to the door, and Catherine was soon climbing into the carriage, but she could not leave until she had asked Eleanor with trembling lips to give her kind regards to her absent friend. But, by almost mentioning his name, Catherine's tears began again, and she found her seat and covered her face with her handkerchief. Chapter 11. Reliable Family Life. Catherine felt too unhappy to be frightened by the journey to Fullerton, and began it without worrying about its length or about being alone. Leaning back in the corner of the carriage, crying and feeling cruelly treated, she had gone a number of miles beyond the walls of Northanger Abbey before she raised her head and looked out of the window. She recognized the road as the same one that had taken her to Woodston only 10 days earlier. And she suffered even more as she thought about the difference between that trip and this one. Every mile, as it brought her nearer Woodston, added to her grief. When the carriage passed the road that led directly to Woodston, Catherine thought of Henry and the day that she had spent at his house there. It had been one of the happiest days of her life. On that occasion, the General had given her the impression that he actually wished for Henry to marry her. Yes, only 10 days ago she had felt so happy about the future, and now, what had she done, or not done, to deserve such a change in the General's opinion of her? The only offence against General Tilney that Catherine could accuse herself of was her shocking suspicions about what had happened to his wife. But Catherine trusted that her secret was safe with Henry. He would not have betrayed her. It was impossible for the General to know that she once wondered if he might have murdered his wife or made her a prisoner in her own home. Of course, if he did know about her suspicions, he would have a good reason to ask her to leave. But she believed in Henry, and was certain that her secret was safe with him. But more than anything, Catherine was anxious about Henry's feelings when he returned to the Abbey and found that she had been sent away. Would he accept his father's reasons for throwing her out? Or would he regret that she was gone and hate his father for sending her home? Would he argue with his father, or remain obedient and talk only to Eleanor about his true feelings? While thinking over many questions and struggling with doubts about herself, Catherine hardly noticed the hours and miles flying by. How would she explain to her family the circumstances surrounding her sudden return to Fullerton? Would there be any pleasure in returning home with such a story to tell? How could she make it clear to them that Henry and Eleanor were the finest, most interesting and most reliable friends she had ever known? How could she separate them from General Tilney and her family's opinion? It would break her heart if her family judged her friends unfairly. Finally, after a journey which had taken more than 11 hours without accident or alarm, Catherine reached Fullerton just after 6:30 in the evening. We would expect a heroine to return to her native village after achieving great things, with many stories of success to be proud of. But this homecoming was very different from what you or she might have hoped for. Our heroine was returning home disappointed, alone, and without hope or joy. Therefore her carriage passed quickly through the village, and Catherine hurried into her house, unwilling to meet the questioning eyes of friends and neighbours. But you must remember that the Morland family would not have high expectations of any great achievements or successes for Catherine. Instead, although they would be surprised by her unexpected arrival, they would simply be very happy to have her at home again. The two youngest children, a boy and girl of 6 and 4 years old, looked out when they heard the carriage stop at their gate, expecting as usual to see a brother or sister arrive home. But when they saw that it was Catherine returning after an absence of 11 weeks, they jumped for joy, shouted for their parents, and ran out to greet their older sister. The warm, affectionate welcome that Catherine received from her parents and brothers and sisters awakened the best feelings in her heart, and she found her troubled spirit calmed. She even, at first, felt happy. But Mrs. Morland noticed that the poor traveller looked pale and tired, and soon had the family seated round the tea-table. With cups of tea and sandwiches in front of them, everyone was eager to hear about Catherine's adventures and to find out why she had come home without warning. Quite slowly, and with much hesitation, Catherine tried to explain what had happened the night before. And although her parents were usually unwilling to criticize other people, they felt unable to pardon this insult to their daughter. They believed that General Tilney had acted neither honourably nor kindly as a gentleman or as a parent. What could have made him treat a guest so badly? Like Catherine, they could see no reason for his rude behaviour, especially after he had treated her so well for the past 4 weeks. Finally, Mrs. Morland ended the conversation by saying, "It is a strange business, and General Tilney must be a strange man. But you are home now, safe and secure. It is not worth troubling yourself any further about that man's reasons." "But why couldn't he send Catherine home in the proper manner, if he had to leave for Hereford?" asked Sarah, the eldest of Catherine's sisters. "I do not think we will discover his reasons," answered Mrs. Morland. "I feel sorry for his own children, who must have a difficult time with him as their father. But you managed well on your long trip, Catherine, and I am very proud of you. I believe you have grown up quite a lot in the last 11 weeks. I am glad I did not know of your journey while it was happening. But now it has ended, perhaps there is no great harm done. You are not the same little girl that we said goodbye to 11 weeks ago. You have grown up and can take care of yourself now." Catherine hoped that her mother was right about that, but her spirits were quite worn down, and she longed to be silent and alone. She was happy to agree to her mother's suggestion that she should go to bed early and gain the benefit of a good night's rest. Her parents knew she was tired and disappointed, but they had not guessed that she was also suffering from a broken heart. Perhaps it is odd that with a young daughter of 17 just returning from her first adventure away from home, they had not thought of that. As soon as breakfast had ended the next morning, Catherine sat down to write the promised letter to her friend at Northanger Abbey. She regretted the cold manner in which she had left Eleanor Tilney, and the fact that she had never valued her kindness and character enough. But most of all, she worried about leaving Eleanor to deal with General Tilney and his difficult nature. She wanted her letter to say how grateful she was, without reminding Eleanor of how the visit had ended. She wanted to be careful without being cold, honest without placing blame. She did not want to cause Eleanor any pain, and she did not want to embarrass herself in case Henry saw the letter. In the end, Catherine wrote a very short note, in which she expressed her grateful thanks and her affectionate good wishes for Eleanor and her brother, and in which she returned the money Eleanor had given her for her journey. "This is a very strange friendship," said Mrs. Morland, when Catherine had finished her letter. "Soon made and soon ended. I am sorry that you were disappointed, because Mrs. Allen had only good things to say about the Tilney children, and you were so unlucky with your friend Isabella, too. And poor James. Well, we must live and learn. I hope your next new friends will be more worth keeping." Catherine's cheeks went red as she warmly answered, "No friend can be more worth keeping than Eleanor." "If that is true, Catherine, I hope that you and she will meet again sometime in the next few years. It is very likely to happen. Imagine what a pleasure it will be to see her again." But Catherine was not thinking only of Eleanor as she listened to her mother's kind but painful words. What would happen to Henry Tilney if she did not meet him for a few years? Her eyes filled with tears as she imagined such a meeting. He might have forgotten her and have met another young woman who attracted him. The next time she saw him, he might be a married man, with a family of his own. He might not even recognize her. Mrs. Morland was disturbed by her daughter's tears, and proposed a visit to Mrs. Allen. And so mother and daughter began the walk to their neighbour's house, which was less than a quarter of a mile distant. As they walked, Mrs. Morland gave Catherine her opinion of James's broken engagement. "Of course, we are sorry for James, but it is good that the engagement has ended, and there is no harm done in the end. We did not know Miss Thorpe, and she had no personal fortune. And now, after such improper behaviour, we have a very poor opinion of her. James will recover, and I am sure that he will use better judgment next time." Her mother's thoughts made Catherine reflect on the changes in her own circumstances. 3 months ago, she had been full of happy expectations, and had run between her home and the Allens' house 10 times a day, with a light heart and an independent spirit, looking forward to new pleasures and without a care in the world. She could picture herself 3 months ago. And now, what a different young woman she was. The Allens were surprised but very glad to see Catherine, and they too were very angry and displeased on learning how she had been treated by General Tilney. "Catherine surprised us yesterday evening," reported Mrs. Morland. "She travelled all the way in a carriage by herself, and knew nothing about her journey until late Saturday night. General Tilney returned home with the strange idea that he was tired of having her in his house. He must be a very odd man. Very unfriendly, certainly. But we are so glad to have Catherine with us again, and it is a great comfort to find that she is not a poor, helpless creature, but can manage very well for herself." Mrs. Allen was shocked. She filled every pause in the conversation by saying, "I really have no patience with the General." But she did not allow for many pauses. "Bath is a nice place, Catherine, after all," she said brightly. "I did not like the idea of leaving. Did I tell you that I tore my blue dress? I had it mended before we left Bath, and you cannot see the tear. And Mrs. Thorpe was such a comfort to us, wasn't she? You know, you and I were quite lonely at first." "Yes, but that did not last long," Catherine replied brightly, enjoying thoughts of Bath and happier days. "Very true. Then we met Mrs. Thorpe and were always busy. My dear, do you think these silk gloves still look well? I wore them for the first time in Bath. Do you remember that evening?" "Oh, yes, perfectly," answered Catherine. "It was very agreeable, wasn't it? Mr. Tilney drank tea with us that evening, and I thought he was an excellent addition to our little society. He is a kind gentleman, isn't he? I think you probably danced with him that evening. I am not certain, but I was wearing my most expensive dress, do you remember? And Mr. Tilney admired it very much." Catherine felt too emotional to answer, but Mrs. Allen continued, "I really have no patience with the General. He seemed such an admirable gentleman when we met him. Do you know, Catherine, that his lodgings were rented by another family the day after he and his children left? But no wonder. It was such a desirable address." As they walked home again, Mrs. Morland said, "You must be grateful for your old friends. They have loved you and been concerned for your happiness for many years. Having the affection and good opinion of friends like Mr. and Mrs. Allen is much more important than your recent unhappy experience." Catherine knew that these were wise words, but at that moment they meant little to her. Her present happiness did not depend on old friends, but on the behaviour of her newest friends. Mrs. Morland continued encouraging her daughter to forget about the people she had met at Bath as they walked towards home. Catherine listened politely to her mother, but she was silently reflecting that now Henry must have arrived at Northanger. Now he must have heard about her departure. And now, perhaps, the family were leaving the Abbey for Hereford. The following day, Mrs. Morland sat with Catherine and Sarah, her two eldest daughters, as they worked at their various jobs. Catherine had never been hard-working, nor had she liked sitting indoors for very long, but Mrs. Morland noticed that her bad habits had become even worse. The 17-year-old could not sit still, nor concentrate on a piece of work for even 10 minutes at a time. She regularly stood up and walked around the room, or wandered into the garden. Sitting quietly seemed impossible. But worst of all to her mother was Catherine's lack of energy and spirit. She knew her daughter had never been a good worker, but silence and sadness were unusual for her. What had happened to her old, cheerful personality? For 2 days, Mrs. Morland allowed this behaviour to pass without a hint of criticism. But when a third night's rest still had not returned Catherine to her old self, she decided to have a serious talk with her daughter. "My dear Catherine, I am afraid you have become too grand for your own family. Should your father mend his own shirts? Look how steadily your sister is working, while your head is still in Bath. You must remember that there is a time for everything. Now is not the time for balls and theatre. Now is the time for you to be useful to me and to your family." Catherine picked up her sewing basket and sadly replied, "I do not think about Bath. At least, not very much." "Then you must still be upset about General Tilney, and that is very silly of you. You probably will never see him again. You should not worry about things you cannot change." After a short silence, she continued, "I hope you have not found your home disappointing, because it is not as elegant as Northanger Abbey. That would be turning your visit into something evil. Wherever you are, but especially in your own home, you should learn to be content. I was not happy to hear you at breakfast talking so much about the French bread and the beautiful plates at Northanger." "I am sure I do not care about any of that," said Catherine quietly. "I have a book," Mrs. Morland said, "with a very clever essay about young ladies who have been spoiled by making friends with people who are much grander than their own families. I will find it for you later. I am sure it will do you good." Catherine tried to get on with her work, but after a few minutes Mrs. Morland saw her staring out of the window again. She came to the conclusion that her daughter was suffering, and she hastily left the room to find her book of clever essays. Chapter 12. Happily Ever After. Eventually. It took at least 15 minutes for Mrs. Morland to find her book of essays, and then she had a few other tasks to complete before she could return to her daughter. And when she was able to return, she was surprised to find a visitor there, someone whom she had never seen before. With a look of much respect, the young man immediately rose, and Catherine introduced Mr. Henry Tilney to her mother. Mr. Tilney quickly began to apologize to Mrs. Morland. "I am sorry to arrive here without an invitation. I know that you cannot welcome a visitor from Northanger Abbey after what happened to Miss Morland there, but I was impatient to know that she had arrived home safely." "Mrs. Morland, had never blamed Henry or his sister for their father's rude behaviour, and now she was very pleased by this young man's appearance and by his sincere apology. "Thank you, Mr. Tilney, for your kind treatment of Catherine. I believe you have nothing to apologise for. You, and any friends of our children, are always welcome to visit us at Fullerton." Then she continued, with a list of polite questions about Mr. Tilney's journey, the weather, and the condition of the roads. Meanwhile, Catherine remained silent, but her mother could see from her bright eyes and rosy cheeks that she was very pleased by Mr. Tilney's presence. And Mrs. Morland slipped the book of essays into a convenient drawer for a future hour. Eventually Mrs. Morland exhausted her supply of polite questions, and Henry turned to Catherine for the first time since her mother's entrance, and asked, "Are Mr. and Mrs. Allen now at Fullerton?" Catherine struggled to calm her nerves and answer sensibly, but finally made it clear that the Allens were at home. "I would like to pay my respects to them," Mr. Tilney said. His face was now almost as red as Catherine's. "I wonder if you would be kind enough to show me the way to their house, Miss Morland." "You can see it from that window," interrupted Sarah, who continued to sew quietly, but was keeping an eye on what was happening. Mr. Tilney bowed politely, but Mrs. Morland gave her younger daughter a silencing nod. They both understood that seeing the Allens was not the primary purpose of Mr. Tilney's invitation. Mrs. Morland thought that he might want to explain his father's behaviour to Catherine in private, and she did not intend to put any barriers in the way of that conversation. She encouraged Catherine to walk to the Allens' house with Mr. Tilney. Mrs. Morland was correct. Henry Tilney did want to explain his father's rudeness, a difficult task for a son, but that was not his primary reason for wanting to talk to Catherine. Above all, he wanted to explain himself, and before they reached the Allens' house he had done that extremely well. In fact, it was a speech that Catherine thought could not be repeated too often. Henry assured her of his affection, and asked if he could hope that she also loved him, something that you will have no doubts about by this time. Henry was sincerely and completely attached to our heroine. He was delighted by her character and truly loved spending all his time with her. But you must understand that his love and affection for Catherine had its origin in something quite simple. He had recognized that she seemed to admire everything about him, and for this he was very grateful. So on this basis, although Henry would not have been able to explain his reasons to himself, he proposed marriage to Miss Catherine Morland. The visit to Mr. and Mrs. Allen's house was very short. Both Catherine and Henry were thinking of something much more important than chatting about Bath. Henry was polite, Catherine scarcely said a word, and soon the young couple were happily walking along the path together again, with nothing to do except think of their future life together. Can you imagine the joy that filled our heroine's heart? She floated along beside Mr. Tilney in a cloud of happiness as he talked about this and that. But she listened carefully when her dear Henry said that he did not have his father's permission to approach her. On his return from Woodston 2 days earlier, he had been met near the Abbey by his impatient father. In very angry terms, the General had insisted that Henry should never think of Miss Catherine Morland again. This information shocked Catherine, but more important was the fact that Henry wanted to marry her. Knowing that she was loved gave her the courage to try to understand the motives for General Tilney's actions and for his disapproval of her. As Henry's story unfolded, her curiosity turned to delight. His father had found no reason to criticize Catherine's behaviour or her character. He was instead disappointed by his own actions and ashamed of having been misled by Mr. John Thorpe. Catherine, it seemed, was guilty of only one thing in the General's opinion. She was less rich than he had supposed her to be. The General had been deceived by John Thorpe at their first meeting, at the theatre in Bath. On that occasion, Henry had been talking to Catherine, and the General had asked Mr. Thorpe if he knew the young lady. John Thorpe had a misleading and even dangerous habit of exaggerating the importance and wealth of his friends and acquaintances. He seemed to think that this made him more important in the eyes of the world. When he had become friends with James Morland, he had reported to his family that he had met a young man from a very grand family. Then, introducing James to Isabella, he had doubled the amount of his friend's living, multiplied his private fortune by 3 or 4 times, invented a rich aunt for him, and forgot about half of James's brothers and sisters. John Thorpe had continued with this practice of exaggeration when telling General Tilney about the Morland family. He had invented a large private income for Catherine, whom he himself had decided to marry, as well as the promise that she would one day receive an enormous inheritance from the Allans. With this information, which he had no reason to doubt, General Tilney had decided to welcome Miss Morland to Northanger Abbey, and to encourage his son to consider Miss Catherine Morland as a possible bride. Henry and Eleanor knew nothing about their father's conversation with John Thorpe. They were astonished by the kind, friendly attention he showed towards Catherine, and the clear signals he gave Henry that he approved of her as his son's future wife. But on his visit to London, the General had met Mr. John Thorpe again. The younger man was by that time suffering from what he considered to be ill treatment by both James and Catherine Morland. She had refused his proposal of marriage, and James would not accept Isabella's apologies. Now he was eager to change the General's good opinion of the whole Morland family. This time he gave a more accurate account of how many Morland children there were, and the amount of money and possessions the parents had. In fact, he mentioned too many of one and too few of the other. And the Allans? Their entire fortune would be inherited by one of Mr. Allen's nephews. Angry with almost everyone in the world except himself, the General had returned to the Abbey, where you have seen how he behaved towards our heroine. Having heard all this, Catherine forgave herself for thinking that General Tilney could either have murdered or imprisoned his wife. Now she understood how cruel he could be in reality. Poor Henry was blushing with shame while telling Catherine this story. He had had an angry conversation with his father at Northanger Abbey, and had shocked the General by refusing to agree with his judgment of Catherine. He felt tied to Catherine as much by honour as affection. He would not dismiss her from his heart or from his life. He refused to accompany Eleanor and his father to Herefordshire, and declared his intention of asking Miss Morland to marry him. General Tilney had been angrier than he had ever been with his son, and the two had parted without speaking to each other again. Henry had returned to Woodston and had begun his journey to Fullerton on the following afternoon. Mr. and Mrs. Morland were quite astonished to be asked by Mr. Henry Tilney for permission to marry their daughter. They had not suspected a connection between the two young people. But they believed Catherine was worth loving, and they soon happily accepted the situation. They had no reason to object to the marriage, not having heard anything negative about Henry, and liking his pleasing manners and good sense. Mrs. Morland's only additional comment was, "I am sure Catherine will make a poor housekeeper, but practice is a good teacher." Nevertheless, even with everyone celebrating the proposal, Mr. and Mrs. Morland could not approve of the engagement. They had mild tempers, but their principles were strong. They did not expect heartfelt approval from the General, but they required his agreement at least. They assured the pair that they would be happy for them to marry when that agreement was obtained, but not before. And they trusted that it would not be denied for long. There need be no expectation of money from the father, since his son's present income already made him independent and comfortable. Their daughter could not hope for more. The young people were not surprised by this decision. They were, of course, upset, but they parted from each other with the hope that the General's opinion could be changed very soon. Henry returned to what was now his only home at Woodston, to look after his parish and to make improvements to his house for his future wife. Catherine remained at Fullerton, to cry rather dramatically, and to look forward to regular letters from Henry. We need not inquire whether the difficulties of absence were made easier by such secret communication. Mr. and Mrs. Morland never did. They had been too kind to demand promises, and whenever Catherine received a letter, which happened quite often, they always looked the other way. As we approach the last of these pages, you will have guessed that a happy ending is promised very soon. The only doubt can be the way in which perfect happiness was achieved. What circumstance could possibly change the General's opinion of a marriage between his son and Miss Morland? The answer was another marriage. In the course of the summer, Eleanor Tilney married a young man with a large fortune and a very respectable position in society. Such an addition to his own importance threw the General into a good mood for months, and Eleanor insisted that he must forgive Henry and accept Catherine as his future daughter-in-law. Everyone who knows Eleanor Tilney will, I am sure, congratulate her and wish her well in the home and with the man of her choice, away from the strict discipline of Northanger Abbey. My own joy on the occasion is very sincere. I know of no one who, after all her suffering, deserves happiness more. And her husband was a young man who truly deserved her. He was not only rich and important, but also affectionate and charming. Eleanor had known him for years, but General Tilney had approved of him as little as he approved of Catherine, and for the same reason. He came from a respectable family with no money. But then this young man inherited an enormous fortune as well as a title, and the General's opinion changed immediately. Suddenly he too could see that Eleanor's future husband was the most charming young man in the world. And I should add that this was the same gentleman whose careless servant left the laundry lists in a drawer at Northanger Abbey, and involved our heroine in one of her most alarming adventures. Eleanor, and her delightful rich husband, used their influence to persuade the General that Henry should be allowed to marry Catherine Morland. In fact, they explained that Catherine was not, in fact, poor, and would have an income of her own of £3,000 a year, and that her father was much wealthier than John Thorpe had reported during his second meeting with General Tilney. As a result of this happy news, the General soon permitted his son to return to Northanger Abbey, and wrote to Mr. Morland, politely giving his agreement to the marriage of his younger son and the Morlands' eldest daughter. The event which the General's letter permitted soon followed. Henry and Catherine were married. The church bells rang, and everybody celebrated. The wedding took place less than 12 months after the young couple had met, so the General's cruelty did not hurt them very much, or for very long. To begin perfect happiness at 26 and 18 is to do quite well. I should add, moreover, that perhaps the General added to this happiness by delaying the marriage and giving them time to improve their knowledge of each other and to strengthen their attachment. I leave it for you to make a final judgment on this question. Is the purpose of this story to recommend parental cruelty, or to reward